All right, just continuing on. So we had our ethnobotany example, right? So the point of that was basically when we have some question concerning reality, the answer to which will be based upon empirical evidence that we draw from other people's experience, perhaps our own, but others as well. The way that those kind of negative systemic biases can work is that they will exclude from our consideration some of those relevant perspectives such that the results that we draw from an artificially or arbitrarily limited set of experiences will be deficient or faulty, right? It could be better if we took into account all relevant perspectives. So that's basically what we're aiming for. And that's basically key to what Harding thinks makes some claims better than others, right? Whether they are not based upon an unfairly or an unduly limited set of relevant perspectives. That's what she's going to mean by strong objectivity. Basically, where we try to correct for the operation of that kind of bias. So in a deeper sense, she says this is based on the idea of standpoints, which is kind of literally what it sounds like, that everybody in principle occupies a certain, say, position, has a certain standpoint from which they experience the world around them. And basically what we perceive and what we will know and understand will be conditioned by this. So it's easy to see, right? This is basically like Rorty, only it goes further, right? In the same way that Rorty, with regard to Hume, basically said, well, it's not just relative to like human nature in general, but it's actually relative to different historical communities. Harding is saying, well, it's actually further than that. Even within those sort of communities, there's going to be relevant differences depending upon one's social position and the nature of society and so on. So it goes even further in the direction of skepticism vis-a-vis objectivity. Then that's why it's just so interesting that it is Harding, though, who nonetheless wants to hold on to the idea of objectivity, right? Not in the same old way, of course. That's crucial and obvious, I guess. She wants a new idea of objectivity, and basically it's going to be one that tries to be at least less biased by trying to address and correct for the operation of those systemic biases that we've been talking about. So basically she thinks, what we just really need to do, the key thing that has to be done is to try basically to bring that into focus, try to recognize that there are certain perspectives that are excluded, like say the women in the case of the ethnobotany. And just from that perspective, we can just see that the problem is there. We can see kind of what its scope is, and then we can try to start taking steps to address it. So basically he's thinking in general in society, well, there's going to be certain perspectives or certain standpoints that are for some, unjustified reason considered privilege, and those are prioritized, and we tend to see things in those terms, and that just tends to reinforce existing inequalities. We want to then step away from those, recognize that there are some excluded perspectives, or she calls them kind of marginal, basically, see things from that angle so that we can just recognize the full scope of the problem and take steps, as I say, to address it. That's what she's saying. She's never saying that, say, these so-called marginal perspectives are somehow truer, right? Every perspective, in effect, for her is biased, right? There's no such thing as an unbiased perspective. She just thinks, and this is kind of the democratic sense, that if we at least take them all into account, right, we're going to be better positioned to make more compelling, stronger claims about reality. Right, basically to kind of bring them together in the same sort of way in the political context. We think democracy, well, that's basically the point. We don't necessarily know what the answer is, but the best answer might be the one that's arrived at through a democratic process. So that's what she's saying. She's definitely not trying to be like Rorty and what he meant by an ethnocentric account, basically. I mean, she's basically thinking, no, there's actually problems. There are problems that need to be solved. Now, she's talking about sexism, talking about racism, other problems like this. The sort of thing that, well, Rorty didn't actually say anything about. The sort of thing that can call into question whether or not, there are communities in the sense he had in mind. So basically, she's just trying to say the things we say about reality, at least when these tend to be more kind of social questions, questions having to do with social reality, where it really does depend upon people's experience. If we want our claims to be, and I'm looking at this quote second from the bottom here, more accurate, more comprehensive, then it just stands to reason that the first thing we want to do, just kind of step back and just make sure that there's no kind of, say, implicit bias which is excluding from our consideration certain perspectives which may well be relevant to what's in question. A quick little example would be something like this, right? Every semester you may do student evaluations about the courses that you take, basically. It hasn't always been that way. It used to be that if the administration wanted to know how a course was going, they would just call up the professor and ask him or her. That was it. It was taken, assumed that the professor had a privileged perspective, like students don't know anything. Just ask the professor and you'll get the good answer. That might seem biased, right? So, of course, now we're thinking, no, there's actually a bunch of relevant perspectives that were being excluded due to some sort of bias. That is to say, students' perspectives, and so people want now to take those into account. And it just seems pretty obvious, right, that you're going to have the administration or the dean or whoever is going to have a better, right, a more accurate and comprehensive understanding of how a certain course went if, in fact, all relevant perspectives are, asked for their input, basically. Now, this also shows that what Harding has in mind here is really hard, right, much, much harder. It's always easier to deal with fewer perspectives, right? Just like if you're a judge or something, of course it's easier to deal with fewer witnesses, right? But it just seems kind of obvious that that's wrong, right? That you're not going to get as good an answer. The claims that you make about reality are going to be less good if you arbitrarily exclude certain relevant perspectives. You want to try to take it all in. So it can make it harder how you can synthesize and bring all this together. That's not her direct concern in this particular article, but she just thinks this is basically how we need to think about it in general terms, right? You want to step back, do what's necessary to make sure that those kinds of biases are not sort of limiting, the field, the range of perspectives that we take into account, so that the conclusions we draw can be as good as possible. Never perfect? Fine, but better. And that's the crucial thing. We don't get that kind of option with Rorty. He just says it's almost like all or nothing and throws away the idea of objectivity. Where here now she's saying, well, objectivity is just going to mean when our claims are based on as inclusive a set of experiences as possible. So the contrast, there's similarities we wanted to, we don't want to lose sight of with Rorty. They're both basing along this line of a skeptical view. It's just that Harding does go further, and yet hangs on to the idea of objectivity by rethinking it in this way, basically. So that's really quite important. And in the background is basically, I think it's the deep suspicion that the kinds of things Rorty says about community, well, maybe they apply some places, but they don't necessarily apply in, say, our society or most today when considered as a whole. So, if we want to kind of deal with reality of the world as it is, right, she thinks, we're not in a position yet to be thinking about, assuming kind of solidarity. There still are kinds of differences, but maybe we can work something out on the basis of this strong conception of objectivity. So ultimately, again, it's actually kind of the same, really, although she doesn't emphasize it as much, but in the same way that for Rorty, it's basically a pragmatic question, what's going to work well? It's just the focus now shifts a little bit to really like the who question, right? For whom has the pursuit of objectivity not worked, and for whom might the ideal of strong objectivity in Harding's sense work better, basically? For whom? And that's the sense she thinks most people might say, yeah, that could actually work out. I could see that being a good thing kind of from my perspective. Other people may disagree. But that would be the same kind of thing. It's really kind of a practical or pragmatic question still for her, but then the question we're considering, we're not just assuming it applies to everyone the same, but that there are important differences to consider between different people in society. So in a broader sense, she might be aiming for something like solidarity, kind of like a long-term goal along the lines of social progress. But we're certainly not too close yet. And that just kind of goes back to her point earlier that we really got to, not lose sight of the fact that we're not dealing with a situation that's neutral, and we need to deal with it accordingly, basically. I'm just going to shift here, basically. There's a few points. This is all along the same lines, but if you look at the other piece, very short from Rachel McKinnon, it's a very handy idea. It's, in effect, something that's all between the lines in what Harding's saying, but basically saying there is a kind of injustice that has to do with knowledge. We'll call it epistemic injustice, right? And it really matters, right, for those kinds of questions where the claims we make about reality really depend upon others' experience, right? Oneself alone, we don't experience everything. It always depends upon others' experience. And then that just puts front and center the question about, well, who do we listen to? Whose views do we take seriously? Whose experiences are taken into account, right? This is exactly the problem in the ethnobotany example, and it applies in many different kinds of questions in the world we live in today. Basically, there's a couple of different forms. These are just handy terms, basically. They're talking about things that we're already talking about, but it's very handy to give them names like this. So especially this one, testimonial injustice. This is just to say some people are taken more seriously than others. Sometimes that's okay, right? But sometimes it's because of biases, either for somebody, we take them more seriously than we really should, or less seriously than we should, even to the point of discounting or neglecting altogether the things that they say. Basically, it just reflects along the lines of the things Harding was talking about, whether it's questions of gender or race or other forms of inequality and discrimination. These can have huge consequences, right? Exactly what Harding was talking about, because if we don't pay attention to this, if we just let this go under the radar and it feeds into the claims we make that we deem to be scientific and objective, that can then just can reinforce the problems and make them even harder to solve, right? So science would be doing the exact opposite of what it's supposed to be doing. Very handy term to keep in mind. The other is called hermeneutical injustice. There's something almost self-referential here too. Just the very idea of epistemic injustice gives us a very convenient way of getting a handle on this kind of problem when people are excluded. So here it's just sometimes we just don't have the terms or ideas or concepts available to express our experience very well. And that likewise can be a situation of injustice. Basically, one's experience can even if others wanted to take it into account more seriously, they might be unable to do so because it might be very difficult to express it in the first place. So you can think of examples of this, but taken together, but in particular, testimonial form of epistemic injustice applies very, very well to Harding. So it actually just may be very useful when you're thinking about Harding and what her problem is. Basically, she's saying, well, you could think about it like Rorty, I suppose, but you totally overlook then the problem of testimonial injustice, right? There are different perspectives within that. If you ignore them, then you could believe there's such a thing as solidarity in a significant sense and just overlook all of these problems. But that would just amount to reinforcing a certain privileged perspective, a certain dominant perspective over others, and that in no way should be considered, a better thing, certainly not objective. She thinks in general we can do much better when we try to tackle and address the problem of testimonial injustice. That will lead to results that are much better precisely for that reason, right? So the problem with the old idea of objectivity is basically that there was a certain kind of injustice implied. To the extent that we thought we were doing that, we were kind of silencing certain perspectives which should be taken into account, such that when we do, we'll have that more accurate and more comprehensive understanding of what's going on. So try to work through all that, think about that. There'll be a little assignment on this, the last one, and then next week we're going to kind of bring it together, draw out the contrast with Rorty, some of the same points we've already talked about, bring Murphy back into the mix, and to whatever extent we can, try to relate it to the contemporary world.